This is a beautiful area that I live in, and certainly blessed to be able to live here. But the thing is, unfortunately, as I walk through the neighborhood, there is a tendency for me to appear to be a suspect versus a person. I do a lot of running, or used to do a lot of running, and I enjoy running outside. But unfortunately, my skin color, my look tends to have people focus more on me being a suspect or me being a problem than me going out and having a run and exercising my body. But what I do is when I do go out in the neighborhood, I take my little Ebony with me. And what that tends to do is lessen the suspicion. They see the dog, they see the cuteness of the dog, then they see me, and they say, okay, it's okay. He's not a thug, he is a person walking his dog.
Hey everybody, I hope that you enjoyed that little bit of a short story there at the beginning from Stephen, as he was just kind of explaining a little bit of some of his own experience. I just kind of as a quick intro so that you know who Stephen is. We're friends, we've been friends for a few years. We met at church, and so Stephen was an elder at my church growing up. He's known me since I was real little, I'm sure. And so we've known each other for a long time. And Stephen's always been a great encouragement to me. I was just telling him a story earlier today about how much he helped me get started at the beginning of my ministry. He was one of my first big supporters for the coffee shop ministry that I started. And so as I've been thinking through some of the issues that are going on in the country today, and as we've been thinking through issues of race, I just really wanted to talk to somebody who was a friend, who I've known is a very wise man who has a lot of really great thoughts related to these issues, and somebody that could maybe just kind of help us frame the issues a little bit better than maybe some of the things that we see online. So that was my hope for our conversation today, and hopefully you can get to know Stephen a little bit better, hear some of the thoughts that he has to say, and we can just kind of, like I said, reframe those issues a little bit better as we move forward. So welcome, Stephen. Thanks for being here. Thanks for doing this talk with me.
Absolutely. I certainly appreciate you reaching out to me. I was very excited when I got your text asking me if I would be available to sit down and have this conversation with you. We're going through some tough times, now with the COVID situation, and also kind of all of the racism and social injustice that we're seeing and we're going through. I certainly believe that this is not this whole situation is not a movement, a moment. It's a movement. And so, I wanted to be able to, at least have a conversation and kind of voice some of my thoughts. And I think this is a great platform to do so.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think we talked earlier, and you said you were feeling like you wanted to say something, needed to say something. And so I think our timings just lined it up really well so that we can kind of have this kind of conversation. So to start out with, I did want to ask you just a little bit about that, some of that footage we got earlier. I remember I had seen a Facebook post from you where you were talking about kind of why you have a dog, what some of the thoughts that go through your mind when you're walking through the neighborhood. Yep. Can you kind of give me that story a little bit? Tell me a little bit about what that experience has been like.
Absolutely.
That really impacted me.
Yeah, absolutely. So before I go further, this is my little girl, Ebony. She's a 9-year-old toy poodle. My heartbeat. I love her to death. But yeah, so Nick, the thing that I wanted to kind of get across to folks when I put that out on Facebook, this is a beautiful area that that I live in, and certainly blessed to be able to live here. But the thing is, as you know, with all of the racism and all going on, unfortunately, as I walk through the neighborhood, there is a tendency for me to appear to be a suspect versus, a person. So what I do is when I do go out in the neighborhood, I take my little Ebony with me. And what that tends to do is lessen the suspicion. They see the dog, they see the cuteness of the dog, then they see me and they say, okay, it's okay. He's not a thug. He is a person walking his dog. And so it's unfortunate that I have to get to that. It gets to that point, and sometimes I think maybe I'm being paranoid, or I'm just overreacting. But I think it's easier. It's better to be kind of on the safe side than to not do it, right? So that's kind of what I was trying to get after. It's really more about bringing the human aspect into it. A lot of times we think of we see these issues, or we hear about these issues, or we watch them on TV and all, and you kind of think of them as an issue, but in my shoes, it's reality, and I wanted to kind of bring that to focus.
Absolutely, yeah. I remember, like I said, I've appreciated a lot of the things you posted online, but I remember that particularly impacting me because. It was one of those moments where it just hit me that's not something I've ever had to think about.
Yeah.
I've never had to think about how people in my neighborhood will think of me if I'm just out for a walk, or if I'm just, and I remember that really impacting me, that has to be something that you're consciously considering all the time.
All the time.
When you're out in your neighborhood, you have to have your dog out for a walk, because if you don't, the first assumption people have isn't that you live there.
Yeah. It's
that you're, a suspect, that you're somebody that shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
And that's just definitely something that I think a lot of people don't realize. Right. that is your lived experience. That's your day-to-day experience.
There's this. I'm sure you've heard of it. I'm sure that that a lot of people have heard this term called privilege, white privilege, right? And I remember, reading an article where there was a white lady that was saying, I'm not privileged because, I don't drive a fancy car, and, I don't have, millions of dollars. Well, that's not the privilege that we're talking about. The privilege that I'm talking about is the privilege to be able to walk through your neighborhood, and be seen as a person. That's your privilege.
Absolutely.
That is white privilege, because that's what happens if you're white walking through a neighborhood like this. It's a person. They're walking, they're having, they're exercising. People spend hundreds of dollars, and spend lots and lots of time out in their front yards making them beautiful. Mm-hmm. When I walk through the neighborhood, if I were to walk through and kind of stare at a beautiful landscape, mm-hmm. I am not seen as looking at the landscape. I'm seen as casing the house. Mm-hmm. That's the privilege that we're talking about, Yeah. A white person walking through can actually go up, smell the flowers, right, and be considered just doing that.
Yep.
If I did that, the police will be on their way, to find out why I'm.
What's this guy doing? Why is he looking? Yeah.
That's the privilege that
Absolutely.
we're talking
about. No, that's a great point, because I definitely think that gets missed a lot of times when people are talking about those issues. They think that to mention that they have any privilege is to lessen whatever hardships they may have had
Exactly.
to go through, and that's not what anybody's talking about. That's not what you're saying. That's not what I'm saying. We understand that you may have had hardships that you've had to go through, but there are certain hardships, certain things that you have never had to deal with, right, because of the color of your skin, because of your race, right, and not having those hardships on your radar is a type of privilege, and that I remember that was a big thing that I had to learn myself. I've always kind of been in this interesting position because my dad is white, but my mom is Hispanic from South America, mm-hmm. and so I remember being in school. Kids always ask me like, "What are you? Like, what are you?"
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
I can't quite figure it out. You look pretty white, you talk pretty white, but we can't really tell. We can't figure it out.
Right.
And it's weird because I remember when I first started hearing about some of these concepts of white privilege, I felt like it wasn't applicable to me necessarily, because I was like, well, yeah, mm-hmm. they're not talking about me because I'm Hispanic, mm-hmm. or something like that. But I remember distinctly one time it was brought up when I was in high school. I got pulled over about 4 different times in the course of 1 year, just mm-hmm. police cars pulling me over for one reason or another. And all 4 times I got pulled over, I talked to the police officer, and then I was let go without a ticket, nothing, not just a warning. And I distinctly remember a friend of mine, he was joking, but in hindsight I'm realizing, man, that was a pretty dark joke. He was basically saying, he's like, listen, Nick, I think the reason you keep getting pulled over so much is because you're half Hispanic. The reason you get off with just a warning is because you're half white. He said that's what happened. And I remember that was the first time in my life that any sort of interactions with the police and race those connections had never really been made in my mind. And I think that's another issue of white privilege that some people don't talk about is the ability to have an interaction with a police officer that doesn't make you afraid, that doesn't put you on edge, that doesn't make you, everyone gets nervous when they're talking to the police, but it's a whole different level. And so I wanted to ask you, what since that has been the issue that people have been talking about right now, what has your experience been? I don't know, whether growing up, or have you had interactions with the police that you think shaped you as a black man growing up in America?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've certainly been pulled over, super nervous. I know I actually, if you look in my car right now, I've got my registration, instead of it being in the dash, I have it on the console in a little cubby. That way I don't have to reach in. I just can pick it up and show. So you're constantly having to think through, how am I prepared to be pulled over so that there's no incident will happen. But there was one situation that happened. This was years ago. I was actually living in Piperton, just not too far from here. Just moved into our home probably a week or so. Again, out running early one morning, and was probably a quarter of a mile away from my house. Actually, you can see my house across the field from where I was. And a police officer drives up, pulls over, asks me some questions. Where do you live? What's going on? I said, sir, I'm out for a run. I live in the neighborhood. And I said, as a matter of fact, my house is right over there, and so he looked over and said, okay. So I finished my run. I go back to my house and I'm sitting there kind of cooling off. And I noticed the police officer, he circled it 4 times just to, I guess, make sure everything was okay and that I'm where I'm supposed to be and all that. So, it was very awkward. It made me feel, like, I didn't belong there, although, I lived in the neighborhood and enjoyed where I lived. But it just made me feel a little, it made me feel some kind of way in that,
it's like you didn't feel welcome in your own home.
Exactly.
In a way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the thing I did say to the officer as we were finishing our conversation, I said, I appreciate the fact, that we had this conversation, because it makes me feel safe to know that you're that conscious of who is in the area.
Right. You're
paying attention. Yeah. And I think that kind of took him he wasn't expecting to hear that response from me. But it was genuine, but at the same time, it was hurtful, because he singled me out, pulled me over, questioned me, and then 4 times around the block to make sure that,
you actually did live where you said you lived. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. So there was a certain level of distrust even in the conversation itself that was there. Right. Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. So before we were talking, you brought up a really interesting point about a friend of yours that had sent you a message. Because you've had a good job, you've had a good opportunity to live in some of these nice neighborhoods, so that's why you've talked about some of the struggles you've had with that. And a friend of yours sending you a message, you said, that was basically saying you have a nice job, you have a nice house. Yeah. I don't understand how you're oppressed. Yeah. Did I get that right? Is that kind of how the conversation went?
Basically, yeah.
And so what was your response to that friend? What would you say to people who feel that way, who are like, well, he's got it good. He's got it better than I've got it. Yeah. He can't be oppressed. Yeah. How could he feel oppressed?
Yeah. So I read the note that she sent over to me, and I really had to edit my thoughts, because what I wanted to say was my first thoughts. What I wanted to say was not appropriate to say. Yeah. Yep. So I kind of stepped back, took a breath, and I replied back. Well, basically, the person knew me, right, and they knew what I've done, and kind of what I stand for, and Christian, and strong believer in God, and and really want to do the right thing and treat people fairly. So she knew me, and so that's why she replied or asked that question. And so my reply back was, you know me, right? And you're asking that question. But when I go out into the public, people don't know me like you know me. And so because of the color of my skin, because of the way I wear my hair, I am automatically assumed to be a person of, that is a suspect, a thug, a person that's going to do somebody harm. And so that's my life all the time. It's not sometimes, it's not every now and then, it's all the time. So yes, I have, I've had travel all over the world. I've had a chance to live outside of the United States. I've, had nice homes and all. But that doesn't mean that I am not oppressed. That means that I have to work even that much harder, to get the things that I have. Again, it goes back to that privilege thing, right? And so that was my response to her. It's like, hey, step into my shoes for 1 minute, and all of your questions will be answered. But after I read her email, I was a little upset, but then I stopped back and said, actually, she's asking questions and she wants to understand. And I think that's one of the things that I mentioned earlier, that this is not a moment, this is a movement. And in order for this movement to be successful, we have to have allies. White people need to step up and join this movement. Back in the 60s, we had the civil rights movement. The majority of the people that were protesting, that were in that movement, were Black people. And so I wouldn't say it wasn't successful, because there was a lot of really good things that came out of that movement. But at the end of the day, for us to move forward and to get through this and to get to a better place, we have to have allies. And I appreciate white people asking me questions. I think that's the only way we're going to get to that ally, is to have these conversations, to indulge and talk through. And sometimes those conversations are challenging. Sometimes they're very uncomfortable. Right. But in order for us to get to where we need to be, we need to have those conversations. We need to talk through those situations.
And so that could be a way where white people could leverage some of the privilege that they may have.
Absolutely.
For good.
Absolutely.
For a good cause.
Yeah. I mean, I would say the way white people can help in terms of being an ally is to, like you said, to use every single day, use your privilege as my voice in situations that you're in. If you're in a situation, where, you've got, there's some people making racial jokes, step in and be my voice. I'm not in that situation, because if I was there, they probably wouldn't be making those jokes, right? That's how we can move forward. That's how we can, we can be an ally. It's around, walking in my shoes, understanding and trying to understand and feel what I go through. You're not going to ever understand completely, but if you're able to say, hey, you know what, I want to try and understand. I want to try and feel that and really feel that. That's the only way you're going to be able to, ally and move and join and make this movement successful.
Absolutely. No, that totally makes sense to me. And as I mentioned earlier, that's part of why I wanted to have this conversation. You even mentioned this at the beginning, where you were saying a lot of these issues become just that for people. They become issues. They become political platforms or issues that have to do with a particular type of debate. And I think both you and I have had this passion to really humanize these things, to really understand that it's real people made in the image of God that we're talking about.
Absolutely.
And one of the best things we can do is to really empathize, to have compassion, to really try to see things from their perspective, walk in their shoes. And I was hoping that one of the best ways to do that could be if people were able to hear from you, hear your perspective a little bit, and help, like I said, put a human face to something, so that it's not just abstract
Absolutely.
political issue.
Right.
So you also mentioned earlier, that you believe in God, you're a Christian. That's how we met. We met in church originally. As you've thought through these particular issues, how do you think that your faith informs how you think about it? And also, how do you think that you would hope that maybe some of your white friends and fellow Christians, how would you hope that they would allow their faith to inform how they react to these issues and think through these issues?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think it to me, there's this Black Lives Matter, and there's this group that says all lives matter, and then there's a group that says Black Lives Matter, and I personally think that if Jesus was sitting right here today, he would say Black Lives Matter. Not that he would say, he's not saying, white lives don't matter or Hispanic lives don't matter. But at this moment in time, it's about Black lives. It's the social injustice that's been cast on Black people. And this is what we're talking about. And so Black lives matter. I think it's just, to me, it's just that simple. Talking about loving your neighbor as yourself. If we were to do that, if we were to, as Christians, the kind of the definition of Christian is like Christ, and so Christ says, love thy neighbor as yourself. Yeah. Love your neighbor as yourself. So if we claim to be Christians and we are like Christ, we should do that. Right. And if everyone did that, we would not have the situation that we're in, right?
The issue wouldn't be there to begin
exactly,
with.
And so again, I try to break things down into their simplest forms, and I read the Bible. One of the things, I have a daughter, Journey. She's almost 21 now, and one of the things that I talked to her about as she was growing up, and I said, Journey, you're going to face during your formative years and your college years, you are going to face situations, and you're going to have to make a decision. And I said, but while you're making that decision, just stop and ask yourself, what would Jesus do? And then do that, right? And I guarantee you that decision that you make, if you're basing it on what Jesus would do, is the right decision, And so I say that to say, again, breaking it down to the simplest form, what would Jesus do in this situation like this? He tells us, he says, love your neighbor as yourself. Yeah. And if we would do that, then, but that's, so that's my belief.
And that shouldn't be a controversial statement to make. Right. It should be pretty something that we can all agree on.
I mean,
sure.
if you think about what we're talking about, we're talking about social justice. We're talking about equality. Why is it so wrong for me to say I want to have equal rights just like everybody else? Why is that even a conversation? If you think about it from that perspective, why are we even having that conversation? I was made in the image of God, just like you were, just like, everybody is. And so why is it so wrong for me to say I want to have equal rights just like everybody else?
Yeah. I want to be able to walk through my neighborhood without being a suspect. I want to be able to, yeah. It is one of those unfortunate things that, as Christians, we believe the world is, it's messed up in some crazy ways, and so it is just unfortunate that things like that shouldn't be controversial, that shouldn't be divisive. There are ways that the enemy finds ways to make that divisive, to make that more controversial than it needs to be. You were talking about the importance of loving your neighbor as yourself. It really, I was reading a post recently that made me think about. Somebody was saying that when Jesus says that, when he says that phrase, love your neighbor as yourself, he's talking to this lawyer, this really smart guy who knows the Bible really well, and that's when the smart guy turns around and he says, well, who is my neighbor? He's trying to he's trying to find. Jesus makes a really simple statement, and the lawyer is like, well, what do you mean by that? Who is my neighbor? Mm-hmm. And it's so interesting to me that Jesus' response to him is to tell that story of the Good Samaritan.
Right.
And the Samaritans were these people that the Jews were like, well, they're not. There's no such thing as a Good Samaritan in their mind. And it's precisely by like leaning in on that prejudice, that racism that they had. That's how Jesus answers the question of who is my neighbor?
Yep.
What does it mean to love my neighbor as myself?
Exactly.
He specifically leans into the people that your culture and your society tells you are not your neighbor. That's precisely who I want you to love.
Right.
And I've always thought that is that sort of loving people who you don't, who, you know, it's easy to love people who look the same as you.
Absolutely.
It's easy to love people who have experienced the same as you. What Jesus is calling to is to love your neighbor, and he defines your neighbor as those people that might not be the ones that look exactly like you. And I think that's definitely a big part of it there too. So more generally speaking, I guess, what do you have any thoughts, any specific ways of framing the issue that you feel like you haven't seen brought up much in social media conversations, or just, you know, like, do you have anything in particular you feel like you wanted to say that you know, would kind of take this opportunity to say, you know, what's on your mind? I want to hear from you. What are you thinking?
Yeah. So I think one thing that I hope to see more of, and I've seen it, and I mentioned earlier, it's just around, you know, the allies, right? Again, it's going to be important that you know, white people empathize. You know, they walk in. You know, they attempt to walk in my shoes, to attempt to understand, you know, the plight of Black people, to be able to then walk with us as we move through this, and as we evolve this movement, right? I think the other thing, kind of along those lines, is I'd like to see the church take a more proactive stance in this movement as well, right? You know, it's important. You know, I heard you know, someone say, you know, well, it's not my position as a pastor to voice my personal opinion on, you know, the situation, right? Well, I'm not asking for your personal opinion, but I'm asking for a stance. Where do you stand? Where does the church stand, you know, in times like these, right? And it's important that, I think it's important that you know, as you look at allies, I'm not talking about individual people, but I'm also talking about, you know, the church, and allying with, you know, with this movement, and making sure that, you know, your stance is out there, that you are preaching and making this visible, this conversation visible in the pulpit, because it is something that needs to be talked about, and it's something that as a body of believers, we need to embrace as allies, and move forward.
Absolutely, yeah. So it is an important issue that the culture needs to see the church affirming the realities of you know, the value of human beings being made in the image of God and all that.
Absolutely. I'm not talking about bringing politics into the pulpit. Absolutely not saying that. But at the end of the day, we're not talking, you know, again, it goes back to the issue versus the human, right? This is not, these are issues, but they are humans that are being impacted. And, you know, at the end of the day, I mean, that's what the church is all about. It's about, you know, humans, and making sure that we're, you know, that the church is taking that stance to stand up for human rights, you know, and that's what we're talking about.
Absolutely. So, I struggled. I was trying to figure out. It's taken me several years as I've been thinking through these issues, you know, from some of the original things that came online. It's taken me a long time to really think through things, and to really be convinced, I guess, of some of these issues, and to be able to not react negatively, and hear what people are actually saying. But I know that there are other people that may not have spent all that same time thinking through everything as I have. And so I was trying to just think through what are some of the typical objections I may have heard from different people. And I'd be curious if you know, I'm sure you've seen all the same objections too. I'm curious what your thoughts are when you hear people say things similar to this. And the biggest one I've seen recently is that from people, I've seen a lot of objections to being able to affirm the phrase Black Lives Matter because they're worried about affiliating themselves with either the political movement or the specific nonprofit party that goes by the same name of Black Lives Matter, that they feel affirms certain political and moral ideologies that they can't, as Christians, affirm themselves. Have you seen people posting that? Have you seen that sort of frustration?
Absolutely.
What would you say to those people who are like afraid to even say the phrase or to even wade into these issues because they don't want to be associated with certain movements or certain people that they feel don't represent what they believe?
Yeah. So I've heard people say all lives matter, but are reluctant to say Black Lives Matter. And my question to them is, how can you say all lives matter if you cannot say Black Lives Matter, unless you are assuming or insinuating that Black lives are not part of all lives, right? So again, I mean that's my point. When I say Black Lives Matter, I'm talking about Black lives. I'm not trying to put myself in any type of in any group or anything. It's about Black lives mattering, right? I mean, I have a daughter, I have a wife. You know, their lives matter. You know, just as much as my wife and as much as your life. You know, our lives matter. You know, but at this particular point in time, we're talking about Black lives, and that's my point. It's about, you know, you've heard tons of analogies around this, right? You know, in October, there's Breast Cancer Awareness Month, right? We're not saying that cancer, you know, all cancer matters. All cancer matters, but at this particular point in time, in October, when people are walking around with pink outfits on, their focus is on breast cancer. And so that's my point. It's like, hey, yeah, absolutely all lives matter. But now we're talking about Black lives, you know, and so that's my, you know, that would be my answer or my response to someone who is reluctant to say Black Lives Matter. Yeah,
I think it's beneficial. It's helpful for people to see, you know, people who know each other, people who love each other, having good civil conversation as we're talking through these issues. And I would agree with you. I have been discouraged a little bit myself sometimes in that I do think the scriptures have something to say to this issue about the value of human beings, the value of human life, and you know, the necessity of allowing for human flourishing, whatever the color of your skin. And I do hope that we can start to see that a little bit more, start to see more of the church taking a stand on some of these issues and really making it known what to believe about some of this. So, do you have any closing thoughts? Anything else you want to say? Anything you want to leave with as we finish up here?
Yeah. Well, again, I appreciate you reaching out to me and us having this conversation. One of the things that I just kind of maybe wrap up and close with this thought. There was a video that came out just a few days after the George Floyd incident, situation, and it was a young kid, Black kid, and he was singing, and part of the lyric is "I just want to live," and that video really touched me, and the reason why it touched me so much is because you look at this guy, this 12-year-old boy. And he is perfectly healthy. You know, he's not saying I want to live because I've got some terminal illness that, you know, that eventually is going to take my life. He's saying I just want to live because I am a human being. And, you know, if someone sees that video and is not touched and doesn't feel that pain that little boy is expressing through that video, then they don't have a heart. And so that when I talk about empathy and talking about, you know, feeling for just a moment what I go through and what that little boy is singing about every single day of my life, that's what we need to get to from an ally perspective, right? And so I hope that that this discussion, will help to maybe shed a little bit of light on someone who may be watching right now with some question marks. Please, do your part. Have the conversation. Reach out to someone, like me. Talk about, ask questions and try to, understand. You won't fully understand. You'll never fully understand. But try to empathize, because until that happens, until you really are empathetic about the situation, you're not going to be able to understand and not going to be able to be effective in the movement.
So until we can really have that empathy, really feel the feelings, absolutely, then when we talk about the issues or think the thoughts, it's not really fully. We don't really fully understand it. We're not really fully talking about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, yeah. I think that's great. I would super affirm that as well. Yeah. I think that is the importance, and so I think that's the challenge I'll try to leave us all with here. Hopefully the big takeaway we can take from this conversation is that, like, the real challenge for all of us as Christ followers, especially, but just human beings more generally, is to really make an effort to feel what our brothers and sisters are going through, to empathize with what they're going through.
Absolutely.
And to do that first before we try to talk or before we try to have issues, and then we'll hopefully be having much more productive conversations at that point once we can have done that step first.
Absolutely.
Awesome. I appreciate it, Stephen. Thanks. This has been a great talk. And so thanks for doing it.
Absolutely. You're very welcome. Thank you, Nick. All right.